44. Mother Bear became foster parent for 50 orphaned human babies. What happened after years shocked everyone. The snow fell harder than Ethan Marshall had ever seen in his 15 years as a park ranger. Each flake seemed heavier than the last, pressing down on the mountain like a thick white blanket that muffled every sound except his own labored breathing. His boots crunched through the fresh powder, sinking deeper with each step as he pushed forward through the storm. Something wasn't right about today. He'd felt it since dawn when he'd started his routine patrol of the northern boundary, that peculiar tingling at the base of his skull that always meant trouble was brewing in his territory. The radio at his hip had gone silent hours ago, the storm cutting him off from the station, leaving him alone with nothing but the howling wind and his own thoughts. He'd been tracking something for the past 3 miles, though he couldn't quite figure out what. The prints were unlike anything in his field guide or his years of experience. They looked like bear tracks at first glance, massive paw prints that suggested a grizzly of unusual size, but there was something else mixed in with them. Smaller marks, delicate and strange, almost like tiny human footprints scattered around the larger ones. But that was impossible. No one brought children this deep into the wilderness, especially not in weather like this. The nearest town was 40 miles south, and the access roads had been closed for 3 days. Yet the tracks continued, weaving through the trees with a purposeful direction that made his skin prickle with unease. The path led him deeper into territory he rarely patrolled, where the old-growth forest grew so thick that even in summer, barely any sunlight reached the forest floor. Here, the trees were ancient giants, their trunks so wide it would take 6 men holding hands to circle them. The storm seemed quieter in this place, as if the massive trees were absorbing the sound, creating a cathedral of silence that made every small noise echo strangely. His breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have, and he noticed the temperature was oddly warmer here, despite the elevation. The tracks grew fresher, the edges still sharp and clear despite the falling snow. Whatever he was following was close. That's when he heard it. A sound that made him stop dead in his tracks, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. It was singing. Soft, melodic humming that drifted through the trees like a ghost's whisper. But it wasn't quite human. The notes were too low, too resonant, vibrating through his chest in a way that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Yet there was something undeniably maternal about it, like a lullaby being hummed by a mother to her child. Ethan had heard bears vocalize before, the huffs and growls and occasional whines, but never anything like this. Never anything that sounded so deliberately musical, so intentionally soothing. He followed the sound, moving more carefully now, placing each foot with practiced silence. The tracks led to a cluster of massive boulders that formed a natural wall against the mountainside. As he got closer, he could see an opening, a cave entrance partially hidden by overhanging rock and a curtain of icicles. The humming was coming from inside, along with other sounds that made his mind struggle to process what he was hearing. Soft cooing, like babies making contented noises. Multiple babies, many of them. His rational mind told him to turn back, to return to the station and bring backup, but something deeper, some instinct he couldn't name, pulled him forward. The cave entrance was larger than it appeared from a distance, tall enough that he could walk through without ducking. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature change hit him like a physical force. It was warm, genuinely warm, like stepping into a heated building. But there was no fire, no obvious source of heat. The cave opened into a massive chamber, and what Ethan saw there made his legs nearly give out beneath him. His flashlight beam trembled as his hand shook, illuminating a scene that his brain simply couldn't accept as real. The bear was enormous, easily the largest grizzly he'd ever encountered. Her dark brown fur thick and healthy, despite it being the depths of winter when bears should be hibernating. But it wasn't her size that made his breath catch in his throat. It was what surrounded her. Dozens of human infants and toddlers, all arranged in what looked like carefully organized groups. Some were sleeping, nestled against the bear's massive body. Others were awake, playing with simple toys made from sticks and stones. A few of the older ones, maybe 2 or 3 years old, were walking around, their movements sure and confident despite their age. And the bear, this massive predator that could tear him apart with a single swipe of her paw, was gently nuzzling one of the crying babies, making soft rumbling sounds that immediately calmed the child. Ethan's flashlight clattered to the cave floor, the sound echoing sharply in the chamber. The bear's massive head turned toward him, and their eyes met. He expected to see the flat, emotionless gaze of a wild animal, maybe aggression or fear. Instead, he saw something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Intelligence. Deep, profound intelligence that looked right through him, evaluated him, and found him acceptable. The bear made no move to attack, didn't even position herself defensively over the children. Instead, she made a soft chuffing sound and gently nudged one of the toddlers back when it started to wander too close to Ethan. The ranger's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. These children, where had they come from? Some looked newborn, others several years old. They were clean, well-fed, their cheeks rosy with health. Makeshift cloth diapers, clearly scavenged from somewhere, covered the younger ones. There were bottles, actual baby bottles, lined up against one wall of the cave, and what looked like a stockpile of formula and baby food. How was this possible? How could a bear, a wild animal, be caring for human children, and not just keeping them alive, but actually nurturing them, raising them? One of the toddlers, a little girl with dark, curly hair, walked right up to him without fear. She reached out her small hand and touched his leg, looking up at him with bright, curious eyes. When she spoke, it wasn't in words, but in a series of sounds that seemed half human, half animal. The bear responded with similar sounds, and suddenly the child laughed, a pure, delighted sound that echoed through the cave. More children began to stir, and Ethan found himself surrounded by tiny humans who showed no fear of him, who moved with an unusual grace and confidence that seemed beyond their years. The bear moved then, her massive form shifting with surprising gentleness to avoid disturbing the sleeping infants against her side. She walked toward a deeper part of the cave, looking back at Ethan with what could only be described as an invitation. Against every bit of training, every instinct that told him this was dangerous beyond measure, he followed. The deeper chamber was even more incredible. It was organized, deliberately arranged for childcare. There were designated sleeping areas padded with dried grass and moss, a corner that was clearly for waste, kept meticulously clean, and most shocking of all, cave paintings on the walls, crude but recognizable drawings that showed the bear and the children, stories told in pictures that suggested this had been going on for much longer than seemed possible. The bear led him to a particular section of the wall where the paintings were different, older looking. They showed a woman transforming into a bear, or perhaps a bear becoming a woman. Around her were symbols that Ethan recognized from his limited knowledge of local indigenous art. These weren't recent additions. These paintings were old, possibly ancient. The bear sat down in front of them and made a low, mournful sound that needed no translation. It was the sound of loss, of grief so profound it transcended species. As Ethan studied the paintings more carefully, trying to understand their story, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices. human voices coming from the direction of the cave entrance. His radio, dead for hours, suddenly crackled to life. Search and rescue teams were in the area looking for him. They'd be here within minutes. He looked at the bear, at the children who were now all awake and watching him with those strange, too knowing eyes. If the search teams found this place, what would happen? The children would be taken, separated, put into the system. The bear would likely be shot, deemed too dangerous despite what Ethan had witnessed. Here, this incredible, impossible family would be destroyed. The bear seemed to understand the danger. She moved quickly but carefully, gathering the children with sounds and gestures they obviously understood. Within moments, they were disappearing deeper into the cave system, into passages Ethan hadn't even noticed. But before she left, the great bear approached him one more time. She stood on her hind legs, towering over him, and for a moment Ethan thought this was it. This was when the wild animal would show its true nature. Instead, she placed one massive paw gently on his shoulder, the weight of it careful, controlled. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw a plea as clear as if she had spoken it aloud. Protect them. Keep the secret. Then she was gone, vanished into the darkness with her impossible children, leaving Ethan alone in the cave with only the paintings and his racing thoughts. The voices were getting closer. He had maybe a minute to decide what to tell them, what to do with this earth-shattering discovery. His whole life, he'd been a man of rules, of regulations, of doing things by the book. But what book had a chapter on this? What protocol covered finding a bear raising human children in a cave? Children who were healthy and happy and loved in a way that many human children never experienced. He made his decision. When the search team found him, he was outside the cave, sitting on a boulder and looking dazed. He told them he'd gotten turned around in the storm, taken shelter in a shallow cave to wait it out. His radio had malfunctioned from the cold. He was fine, just tired and a bit embarrassed. No, he hadn't seen anything unusual, just another storm in the mountains. They bought it. Why wouldn't they? Ethan Marshall was known for being reliable, truthful, never one for tall tales or exaggeration. They helped him back to the station, and he filed his report. Got lost in storm, found shelter, no incidents of note. But that night, lying in his bed in his small ranger cabin, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. Those children. The way they'd looked at him without fear. The way they'd moved with such unusual grace. And the bear. That impossible maternal bear with human intelligence in her ancient eyes. He thought about his own childhood, bouncing from foster home to foster home after his parents died when he was 7. He remembered the cold beds, the indifferent caregivers, the constant feeling of being unwanted, a burden to be managed rather than a child to be loved. Those children in the cave, raised by a bear in the wilderness, had more love and stability than he'd ever experienced in the system. 3 days passed before he went back. He told himself he was just checking, just making sure he hadn't imagined it all. The storm had passed, leaving the forest crystallized in white beauty. He brought supplies this time, things he'd bought with his own money in town, trying not to draw attention. Formula, diapers, some basic medicines. He wasn't sure the bear would even be there, or if she was, whether she'd trust him enough to return. But as he approached the cave, he heard it again, that low, melodic humming that seemed to vibrate in his bones. She was there, the children arranged around her like she'd never left. When she saw him, she made a sound he could only describe as grateful. The children remembered him too. The little girl with curly hair running to him, with her arms raised in the universal gesture of wanting to be picked up. He lifted her, surprised at how solid she felt, how healthy. She smelled like pine and earth and something wild but not unpleasant. The bear watched but didn't intervene, that intelligence in her eyes assessing, approving. Ethan spent hours in the cave that day, observing, trying to understand how this impossible situation worked. He watched the bear nurse some of the younger infants with bottles she'd somehow filled with formula, her massive paws impossibly gentle as she held them. He saw her change diapers with a dexterity that shouldn't have been possible, using her teeth and claws with surgical precision. The older children helped, bringing supplies, comforting the younger ones, working together with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. It was a functioning family unit, more functional than many human families he'd known. As the sun began to set, painting the cave entrance in shades of gold and red, Ethan knew he had to make a choice. He could walk away, pretend he'd never seen this, and let them exist in secret. Or he could become part of it, help them, protect them. The bear seemed to sense his internal struggle. She approached him slowly, one of the newest infants in her arms, a tiny thing that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. She held the baby out to him, and he took it instinctively. The infant was warm, content, making small sucking sounds in its sleep. Looking down at that tiny face, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a wall he'd built around his heart after years of disappointment crumbling. He looked up at the bear, this impossible creature that had somehow become a mother to the motherless, and nodded. He didn't know what he was agreeing to, not really, but he knew he couldn't walk away. The bear made a sound that was almost like a sigh of relief, then gently took the baby back. As Ethan prepared to leave, she led him to another part of the cave he hadn't seen before. It was a storage area, filled with things she'd somehow gathered. There were books, children's books with pictures, clothes in various sizes, toys, simple ones but clearly loved. And in the corner, carefully preserved, were documents. Missing person reports, newspaper clippings, police bulletins, all for infants and young children who had disappeared or been abandoned over the past several years. The implications hit him like a physical blow. These weren't random children. These were the lost ones, the abandoned ones, the ones who had slipped through society's cracks. Somehow, this bear had been finding them, saving them, raising them. But how did she know where to look? How did she manage to get them before they died of exposure or starvation? The logistics of it were mind-boggling, impossible. Yet here was the evidence, living proof that it was happening. One of the older children, a boy who looked about 4 or 5, approached him with a piece of paper and what looked like a crayon. He drew something quickly, then handed it to Ethan. It was a crude drawing, but the meaning was clear. It showed the bear finding a baby in a dumpster behind what looked like a building. Then the bear carrying the baby to the cave. Then the baby growing bigger, surrounded by other children and the bear. It was their story, all of their stories probably, told in simple pictures. The boy pointed to himself, then to the first image. He'd been the baby in the dumpster. Ethan felt tears burning his eyes, something he hadn't experienced in years. These children, thrown away by society, had found a mother in the most unlikely creature imaginable, and that mother had given them what humans hadn't: unconditional love, protection, a family. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and completely impossible, yet it was real. He was looking at it, touching it, breathing it in. As he left the cave that evening, promising in gestures and expressions to return, he knew his life had just changed irrevocably. He had a secret now, the biggest secret imaginable. And he had a purpose, something he'd been searching for without even knowing it. The drive back to his cabin was surreal. The normal world seemed fake somehow, like a movie set after witnessing something so profound. He passed hikers on the trail, fellow rangers at the station, people going about their ordinary lives with no idea that something extraordinary was happening just miles away. He wanted to tell someone, needed to tell someone, but who would believe him? And more importantly, who could he trust with this secret? The wrong person finding out would mean disaster for those children, for that incredible bear who had somehow become more human than most humans he knew. That night, he made a decision. He pulled out his personal laptop, not the government-issued one, and began researching. Not about bears or abandoned children, but about someone specific. Dr. Jessica Brooks, a wildlife biologist who had written several papers on animal intelligence and interspecies communication. She was considered a bit of a radical in her field, proposing theories about animal consciousness that mainstream science scoffed at. But her research was solid, her credentials impeccable, and most importantly, she had a reputation for discretion and ethics that went beyond just following rules. She understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the legal thing to do. It took him 3 days to craft the email. How do you tell someone about something like this, without sounding completely insane? In the end, he kept it simple. He'd observed some unusual animal behavior that challenged conventional understanding of ursine capabilities. Would she be interested in a confidential consultation? He mentioned some of her specific papers, showing he'd done his homework. He suggested a meeting, in person, no recordings, no official documentation. The kind of meeting that scientists who value discovery over career advancement might find intriguing. While he waited for a response, Ethan continued his visits to the cave. Each time he brought supplies, careful to buy them from different stores, always paying cash, never creating a pattern that could be traced. The bear began to anticipate his arrivals, and the children grew more comfortable with him. The little girl with curly hair had claimed him as her special friend, always running to greet him, showing him things she'd found or made. He started learning their communication system, a complex mixture of sounds, gestures, and expressions that conveyed meaning without words. The bear was the teacher, patient and deliberate in her instructions. On his 5th visit, something extraordinary happened. One of the older children, a boy who looked about 6, spoke to him. Not in the animal-human hybrid language they usually used, but in actual English. "Thank you," he said clearly, though with an odd accent Ethan couldn't place. "For helping. For not telling." The shock must have shown on Ethan's face because the boy smiled, a wise expression that seemed too old for his years. "Mother teaches us," he explained, gesturing to the bear. "Both ways, animal and human, so we can choose when time comes." The bear was teaching them language. Somehow, this wild animal was teaching human children to speak, to prepare them for potentially rejoining human society someday. But how? How could a bear know human language well enough to teach it? The mystery deepened with every visit, every observation. There were moments when the bear's movement seemed almost human, when her eyes held knowledge that no animal should possess. The cave paintings he'd seen on his first visit haunted him. A woman becoming a bear, or a bear becoming a woman. Indigenous legends were full of shapeshifters, beings that could walk between worlds. He'd always dismissed them as mythology, but now... Dr. Brooks responded to his email on the 7th day. She was intrigued but cautious. She proposed a preliminary meeting, just the 2 of them, in a neutral location. If what he had to share was as significant as he suggested, she would consider a field visit. But she warned him that she had no patience for hoaxes or delusions, and if this was some attempt to gain attention or funding through false claims, she would expose him professionally. Ethan respected her caution. In her position, he'd be skeptical too. They met at a small coffee shop in a town halfway between his ranger station and the university where she worked. Jessica Brooks was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an intensity that suggested a brilliant mind always working. She listened without interrupting as he carefully, methodically laid out what he'd discovered, starting with the tracks and building to the full revelation. He showed her photos he'd taken on his phone, careful shots that proved what he was saying, without revealing the location. Her expression went from skeptical to shocked to absolutely fascinated. "This is impossible," she said finally, but her tone suggested she believed him anyway. "Everything we know about bear behavior, about animal cognition, says this can't happen. Bears don't adopt human young. They don't use tools like bottles. They certainly don't teach language." She studied the photos again, zooming in on details. But these images, the organization of the space, the clear evidence of planning and foresight. If this is real, it's the discovery of the century. It rewrites everything we think we know about animal intelligence. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice even though they were alone in their corner of the nearly empty shop. "I need your help. Not to study them like lab rats, but to protect them. To understand what's happening and make sure they're safe. Those children are healthy and happy. But what happens when they get older? What happens if someone else discovers them? And the bear, there's something different about her. Something that goes beyond just high intelligence. I think—" He hesitated, knowing how crazy it would sound. "I think she might have been human once." Jessica didn't laugh or call him crazy. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and began showing him research she'd compiled over the years. Stories from various cultures about human-animal transformations that had surprising consistency. Modern cases of children raised by animals who displayed unusual abilities. Theoretical papers on consciousness transfer and genetic memory that mainstream science ignored but couldn't quite disprove. "I've been waiting my whole career for something like this," she admitted. "Proof that the boundary between human and animal isn't as fixed as we believe." "When can I see them?" They planned carefully. Jessica would take a sabbatical, claiming she needed time to write her next book. She'd rent a cabin near Ethan's station under an assumed name, paying cash, leaving no paper trail. They'd visit the cave together, but only after Ethan had prepared the bear for a new person's arrival. Everything had to be done with extreme caution. One wrong move, one person getting suspicious, and it would all fall apart. The children would be taken, studied, separated. The bear would be caged or killed. And perhaps most tragically, a love story between species that challenged the very nature of consciousness would be destroyed. As Ethan drove back to his station that night, he thought about the journey he'd started, from a simple ranger following tracks in a storm to guardian of an impossible secret. He thought about those children, growing up wild and free, but also educated and prepared for whatever future they chose. He thought about the bear, that magnificent creature who had somehow transcended the limitations of her species to become something unprecedented. And he thought about Jessica Brooks, brilliant and brave enough to risk her career for truth rather than accolades. The next morning brought fresh snow, and with it, fresh determination. Ethan gathered more supplies, this time including educational materials Jessica had suggested. Books with more complex stories, basic math manipulatives, art supplies that could help the children express themselves in new ways. As he hiked toward the cave, he felt the weight of responsibility but also a lightness of purpose he'd never experienced before. He was part of something extraordinary now. Something that could change how humanity understood its place in the natural world. The bear was waiting for him at the cave entrance, sitting upright in an almost human posture. The children were arranged behind her, all awake, all watching. There was an air of expectation, as if they knew something was changing. The little girl with curly hair didn't run to him as usual, but stayed close to the bear, one small hand buried in the thick fur. Ethan approached slowly, respectfully, understanding that this was some kind of test or perhaps a ceremony. The bear stood, her full height magnificent and terrible, and walked toward him with deliberate steps. When she was close enough that he could feel her breath on his face, she did something that made his knees nearly buckle. She spoke. Not in human language, but in a series of complex vocalizations that his brain somehow translated into meaning. It wasn't telepathy exactly, more like the deepest part of his consciousness suddenly understanding a language it had always known but forgotten. She was telling him her story, their story, and asking him to make a choice. Not just to help, but to become part of their family truly and completely. To be not just a protector, but a father to these children who had no one else. The weight of that request, the honor and terror of it, made him sink to his knees in the snow. He looked up at her, this impossible bear mother, and then at the children watching with their too wise eyes. His whole life had been leading to this moment, he realized. Every loss, every disappointment, every moment of feeling disconnected from his own species had been preparing him for this. He reached out and placed his hand on the bear's massive paw, feeling the warmth and strength there, and nodded. Yes. Whatever it meant, whatever it cost him, yes. The children erupted in celebration, their unique voices filling the cave with sounds of joy. The bear made a sound that could only be described as laughter, deep and rumbling and utterly infectious. Even as Ethan stood there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd just agreed to, he found himself laughing too. Because despite the impossibility of it all, despite the challenges that lay ahead, he had found something he'd never thought he'd have. A family. An unusual, impossible, magical family, but a family nonetheless. As the celebration continued around him, Ethan began planning. Jessica would arrive in 3 days. Together, they would document this miracle while protecting it. They would help these children grow and learn, preparing them for whatever future they chose. They would unravel the mystery of the bear, understanding how she'd come to be what she was. And most importantly, they would prove that love, real love, transcended species, transcended logic, transcended everything humanity thought it knew about the world. The snow continued to fall outside the cave, but inside, warmed by bodies and hearts and an impossible love, a new chapter in all their lives was beginning. The sound of a helicopter in the distance made everyone freeze. It was far away still, maybe just a medical evacuation from the ski resort on the other side of the mountain, but it served as a reminder of how precarious their secret was. The bear quickly organized the children, and within minutes they had retreated deeper into the cave system, leaving no trace of their presence. Ethan stayed at the entrance, ready to deflect any potential visitors, but the helicopter sound faded without coming closer. Still, it had been a warning. They would need to be even more careful, even more prepared for potential discovery. That evening, as Ethan made his way back to his cabin, he stopped at the overlook that gave him a view of the entire valley. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in those mountains was a cave where the impossible was happening daily, where a bear was raising human children with more love and wisdom than many human parents possessed, where the boundary between human and animal was being rewritten with every passing day, and where he, Ethan Marshall, lonely ranger who had never quite fit into the human world, had found his purpose at last. He pulled out his phone and sent a simple message to Jessica. "They're ready for you. We all are." Her response came quickly. 3 days. I'll bring everything we discussed." He deleted both messages immediately, leaving no digital trail. Then he headed home to prepare for the next phase of this incredible journey. Because in 3 days, their small circle of secret keepers would grow by one, and with Jessica's expertise they might finally begin to understand the full magnitude of what was happening in that cave. The children haunted his dreams that night, but not in a frightening way. He saw them grown, standing at the threshold between two worlds, having to choose their path. Some chose the human world, taking with them the extraordinary gifts their unusual upbringing had given them. Others chose to stay wild, becoming bridges between civilization and nature. And in all the dreams, the bear was there, watching with those impossibly intelligent eyes, proud of what her love had created. When Ethan woke, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Family, after all, was about choice as much as blood, and he had chosen his. The next morning brought a surprise. At the ranger station, his supervisor mentioned that there had been inquiries from state child services about rumors of abandoned children in the mountain areas. Nothing specific, just general questions about whether the rangers had seen anything unusual. Ethan kept his expression neutral, reporting that he'd seen nothing out of the ordinary on his patrols. But inside, alarm bells were ringing. Someone knew something, or suspected it at least. They would have to be even more careful than he'd thought. He made a mental note to warn Jessica, to make sure she understood the full risk of what she was walking into. That afternoon, unable to stay away, he returned to the cave. The bear seemed to sense his agitation before he even explained about the inquiries. She led him to a part of the cave system he hadn't explored before, deeper and more complex than he'd realized. There were multiple exits, carefully hidden, that led to different parts of the mountain. She had prepared for this, planned for the possibility of discovery. The intelligence and foresight she displayed continued to astound him. This was no ordinary animal acting on enhanced instinct. This was a thinking, planning, fully conscious being who happened to inhabit a bear's body. One of the older children, the boy who had spoken English to him before, approached with a worn notebook. Inside were pages of writing, crude but legible, telling stories of their life in the cave. But more than that, there were observations about the outside world, things the child couldn't have known unless the bear had been teaching them about human society, preparing them for eventual integration if necessary. The boy pointed to a particular passage, written in a different hand, older and more sophisticated. It was the bear's writing, somehow. She had found a way to communicate in human language through the children, using them as scribes for thoughts too complex for growls and gestures. The passage was a message for him, for Jessica, for anyone who would eventually know their secret. It spoke of love transcending form, of consciousness being more than flesh and bone. It told of a woman who had loved the forest so much she had chosen to become part of it, to take on the responsibility of caring for those the human world had discarded. It wasn't magic in the fairy tale sense, but something deeper, a fundamental truth about the nature of existence that modern society had forgotten. The children were not just being raised by a bear, they were being raised by someone who had chosen to sacrifice her humanity to save theirs. As Ethan read, tears streaming down his face, the little girl with curly hair climbed into his lap. She didn't speak, just nestled against him with the complete trust that only young children possess. Around them, the other children continued their activities, some playing, some helping the bear with the younger ones, all of them part of this impossible, beautiful family. And in that moment, Ethan understood that This wasn't just about protecting a secret or making a scientific discovery. This was about proving that love, real love, could transform the very nature of reality. When he finally left that evening, it was with a new understanding of his role. He wasn't just a protector or even a father figure. He was a witness to something sacred, something that could change how humanity understood its place in the world. The bear walked him to the cave entrance, and in the fading light for just a moment, he could swear he saw her differently. Not as a bear at all, but as a woman, tall and strong and beautiful, with eyes that held the wisdom of both worlds. Then the moment passed, and she was a bear again, but the image lingered in his mind, a promise of truths yet to be revealed. 2 days until Jessica arrived. 2 days to prepare for the next phase of this incredible journey. As Ethan made his way back through the darkening forest, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also a joy he'd never experienced before. He was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. The children in that cave, raised by impossible love, were going to change the world. Maybe not in dramatic, headline-making ways, but in the quiet, profound way that true miracles always worked. One heart at a time, one truth at a time, one impossible love at a time. That night, he prepared everything Jessica would need to know. Maps of the cave system the bear had shown him, notes on each child's personality and development, observations about their unique communication system. But more than facts and data, he tried to convey the feeling of being there, the sense of witnessing something that shouldn't exist, but did. He wrote about the bear's intelligence, certainly, but more importantly about her love. The fierce, protective, all-encompassing love that had saved these children and was raising them to be something unprecedented in human history. As he wrote, he thought about his own childhood, the cold institutions and indifferent caregivers. He thought about all the children like him, lost in a system that saw them as problems to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. And he thought about the bear, who had somehow found a way to gather these lost ones and give them what the human world couldn't or wouldn't provide. It was heartbreaking and beautiful and absolutely necessary that their story be protected and eventually told. Not as a scientific curiosity, but as proof that love could transcend every boundary humans had created. The final day before Jessica's arrival dawned clear and cold. Ethan made one more trip to the cave, bringing with him a special gift. It was a camera, an old film model that required no batteries or digital components that could be tracked. He showed the bear how it worked, taking a picture of her with the children that would become the most important photograph never shown to the world. She understood immediately, and over the next hour she helped him document their life in careful, composed shots that told their story without exposing their location or identities. The children were excited about the camera, posing and laughing, their joy infectious. But it was the quiet moments Ethan captured that were most powerful. The bear gently cleaning a scraped knee, an older child teaching a younger one to stack stones. The entire family curled together for an afternoon nap, impossible to tell where one ended and another began. These images would never win awards or grace magazine covers, but they were proof of something more important than scientific discovery. They were proof that love could make the impossible possible. As the sun reached its zenith, the bear led him outside the cave to a small clearing he hadn't noticed before. There, hidden under carefully arranged branches, were more supplies she had somehow gathered. Medical equipment, still in packaging. Educational materials far beyond what he'd brought. Even a small solar panel and battery system, though how she'd acquired or set it up was beyond comprehension. She was preparing for something, he realized. Not discovery necessarily, but change. The children were growing, and their needs were evolving. She knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The boy, who spoke English, joined them in the clearing, and for the first time, he told Ethan his name. "Marcus," he said, the word careful and deliberate. "The mother gave me this name." From a book she found. Marcus, who was strong and kind. He paused, looking at the bear with such love it made Ethan's chest tight. She gives us all names. Human names for human world if we choose, but also other names, secret names, for what we really are. He wouldn't say what his other name was, and Ethan didn't ask. Some secrets were meant to be kept, even from friends. As afternoon faded to evening, Ethan knew it was time to go. Tomorrow, Jessica would arrive, and everything would change. Not in bad ways, he hoped, but change nonetheless. The bear seemed to sense his thoughts. She approached him one last time, placing her massive head against his chest in what he'd come to recognize as her version of a hug. He wrapped his arms around her as best he could, feeling the warmth and strength of her, the steady beat of her heart that seemed to rhythm with his own. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if she understood the words, but certain she understood the meaning. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than usual, each step taking him further from the miracle and closer to the complicated reality of protecting it. But as he reached his door and looked back at the mountains, now painted purple by twilight, he felt not sadness, but anticipation. Tomorrow, their small family would grow by one. Jessica would bring her expertise, her resources, her fierce intelligence to bear on protecting and understanding these incredible beings. Together, they would navigate the challenges ahead, making sure these children had the chance to become whatever they were meant to be. That night, Ethan's dreams were different. Instead of seeing the future, he saw the past. A woman, young and broken by loss, fleeing into the forest with nothing but grief and determination. A ceremony by moonlight, indigenous elders who still remembered the old ways, the ways of transformation and sacrifice. A choice made not from magic, but from love so profound it could reshape reality itself. And then the first child found, abandoned by a dumpster, barely alive. The new bear, still learning her body, her strength, carrying that infant to safety. Then another child, and another, each one saved from death or worse, each one adding to a family that shouldn't exist, but did. He woke with the absolute certainty that tomorrow would mark not an ending, but a beginning. Jessica's arrival would start a new chapter in their impossible story. There would be challenges, certainly, close calls and difficult decisions. But there would also be wonder and joy and the slow, careful documentation of a love that transcended species. The children would grow and learn and eventually choose their paths. Some would return to the human world, carrying with them abilities and perspectives that could help heal the broken relationship between civilization and nature. Others would stay wild, becoming the bridge between worlds that humanity desperately needed. And the bear? Ethan smiled in the darkness, thinking of those impossibly intelligent eyes, that profound love that had saved so many. Her story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning to unfold in its full complexity and beauty. Tomorrow, Jessica would meet her, and another human would be forever changed by the encounter. The circle of protectors would grow, carefully, slowly, but it would grow. Because some truths were too important to keep hidden forever. Some love was too powerful to be contained, and some families, no matter how impossible they seemed, were meant to exist. As sleep finally took him again, Ethan's last thought was of the children, safe in their cave, curled against their impossible mother. Tomorrow would bring changes, but tonight they were perfect in their wild innocence, their pure love, their absolute trust that they were exactly where they belonged. And they were right. In a world that often seemed broken beyond repair, they were proof that love could still work miracles. Not the flashy, obvious kind, but the quiet, steady kind that changed everything, one heart at a time. 5 years had passed since Jessica Brooks first entered the cave, and the world within had transformed in ways none of them could have imagined. The children, who had been infants when Ethan first discovered them, were now walking, talking, learning at a rate that defied conventional understanding of child development. The cave system had evolved, too, expanded through careful work into a complex underground home that resembled something between a school and a sanctuary. Jessica had brought solar panels, educational materials, medical supplies, all carefully transported and installed without drawing attention. But more than physical changes, it was the development of the children themselves that astounded both her and Ethan daily. The eldest among them was a girl the bear had named Luna, through a series of sounds that the children translated. She was perhaps 12 now, though exact ages were impossible to determine for most of them. Luna possessed abilities that Jessica documented with scientific precision and personal awe. She could see perfectly in absolute darkness, navigating the deepest parts of the cave system without any light source. Her hearing extended far beyond normal human range, able to detect the heartbeat of a mouse 50 feet away or the approach of hikers miles before they came near the cave. But it was her ability to communicate with animals that truly challenged everything Jessica thought she knew about interspecies interaction. It wasn't telepathy exactly, Luna explained in her careful, oddly accented English. It was more like understanding the language that existed before words, the fundamental communication of living beings that humans had forgotten. She could calm a panicked deer with a sound, could call birds to her hand with a gesture, could even convince predators to share their kills with the family when food was scarce. Jessica had watched her stand perfectly still as a mountain lion approached, then seen the great cat rub against Luna's legs like a house cat before padding away. The other children showed similar abilities to varying degrees, as if their upbringing had unlocked something dormant in human genetics, some ancient connection to the natural world that civilization had bred out of the species. Marcus, the boy who had first spoken to Ethan, had developed into their unofficial leader despite being only around 10 years old. His intelligence was extraordinary, absorbing information from the books Jessica brought like a sponge. He read at a college level, understood mathematical concepts that should have been years beyond him, and showed a grasp of abstract thinking that reminded Jessica of graduate students she'd taught. But it was his emotional intelligence that truly set him apart. He could sense the mood of anyone in the cave, human or animal, and knew instinctively how to help. When the younger children were frightened by storms, Marcus told them stories that turned thunder into the laughter of friendly giants. When Ethan arrived troubled by close calls with other rangers, Marcus would simply sit beside him, offering silent companionship that somehow made everything better. The bear mother, as they all called her now, had revealed more of her mystery over the years, though never completely. Through the children's translations and her own increasingly sophisticated communication methods, she had shared fragments of her story. She had been human once, a woman named Sarah who had lost everything in a way too painful to fully recount. The transformation hadn't been magic in the storybook sense, but something deeper, older, tied to indigenous practices that recognized the fluid boundary between human and animal consciousness. It was irreversible, the children explained when Jessica asked. Sarah had known that when she chose it. She had traded her human form for the ability to save those who couldn't save themselves. The logistics of their operation had become incredibly complex. Ethan had been promoted to senior ranger, giving him more autonomy in his patrols, and the ability to redirect other rangers away from the cave area. He'd created false reports of unstable geological conditions that made the region officially off-limits. Jessica had established herself as conducting a long-term study on bear behavior, giving her a legitimate reason to be in the area frequently. They'd developed supply routes, communication systems, contingency plans for various discovery scenarios. But despite all their precautions, they knew they were living on borrowed time. The children were growing, and some of them were beginning to show curiosity about the world beyond the cave. It was Lily, 7 years old with startling green eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, who first asked the question they'd all been dreading. Why can't we go to the human places? She asked it simply without accusation, but the weight of it filled the cave like smoke. The bear mother made a low, mournful sound, and Jessica saw something in her eyes that looked like human tears. How did you explain to a child that the world outside wouldn't understand them, would fear them, would take them away from the only mother they'd known and put them in sterile facilities to be studied and separated? Ethan tried to answer, his voice gentle but honest. He told them about the beauty of the human world, but also its dangers, its rules that wouldn't make sense to children raised in freedom. He explained that they were special, unique, that they had gifts the outside world wasn't ready to understand. Some of the children accepted this, but others, especially those approaching adolescence, showed signs of restlessness. They'd learned about human society from books and from Ethan and Jessica's stories. They knew there were schools and movies and ice cream and friends their own age. The cave, no matter how loving and magical, was beginning to feel small to some of them. It was during this time of growing tension that something extraordinary happened. A new child arrived, but not in the way the others had. This one came walking into the cave on her own, a girl of perhaps 14, fully verbal and aware. Her name was Avery Johnson, and she'd run away from her 5th foster home. She'd been hiking, lost, preparing to die from exposure when she'd heard it, the bear mother's call. Not with her ears, Avery explained, but with something deeper. She'd followed that call through the storm, through the night, until she'd found the cave. The bear mother had been waiting for her at the entrance, as if she'd known Avery was coming. Avery's arrival changed everything. She was old enough to remember the outside world clearly, to miss it and fear it in equal measure. She told the other children stories of schools where kids were cruel, of foster homes where love was conditional and temporary, of a system that saw children as cases rather than souls. But she also told them about libraries full of all the books in the world, about music concerts where thousands of people felt the same emotion at once, about the taste of pizza and the feeling of riding a bicycle down a hill. Her stories created a divide among the children, those who wanted to experience these things and those who wanted nothing to do with a world that had thrown them away. Jessica watched this development with both scientific fascination and maternal concern. She'd grown to love these children as if they were her own, had spent countless hours teaching them, caring for them when they were sick, celebrating their achievements. The thought of them leaving the safety of the cave terrified her, but she also recognized that they couldn't keep them hidden forever. They were developing into individuals with their own dreams and desires. Luna wanted to be a veterinarian, having read every animal medicine book Jessica could find. Marcus dreamed of teaching others the language of nature he'd learned. Some of the younger ones just wanted to try chocolate ice cream and see if it was as good as the books made it sound. The bear mother understood this tension better than any of them. Through increasingly complex communications, using the children as interpreters, and sometimes writing messages with a stick in the dirt, she conveyed her own struggle. She had saved them because they needed saving, raised them because they needed raising, loved them because they needed love. But she had always known this day would come, when they would need to choose their own paths. She had prepared them as best she could for either choice, to stay wild or to return to civilization. The abilities they'd developed, the education Ethan and Jessica had provided, the emotional resilience she'd nurtured, all of it had been preparing them for this moment of choice. It was Ethan who proposed the solution, though it terrified him to suggest it. They would begin a gradual integration process. The older children who wanted to experience the human world could start with short, supervised visits. Jessica had connections at a progressive boarding school that specialized in children with unusual backgrounds. The director, Dr. Patricia Summers, was known for her discretion and her belief that every child had unique gifts that traditional education often suppressed. Without revealing the full truth, Jessica could present some of the children as having been raised in an isolated commune, homeschooled in unconventional ways. It wasn't entirely a lie. The bear mother agreed to this plan with a heaviness that was palpable in the cave. Over the next weeks, she spent extra time with each child who was considering leaving, not trying to change their minds, but making sure they knew they would always have a home to return to. She taught them emergency signals, ways to call for help that only she would hear, promises that no matter how far they went, she would find a way to protect them if they needed it. Watching her prepare to let them go while trying to be strong for them was heartbreaking. Jessica often found herself crying during these preparations. Seeing a love so pure and selfless, it redefined what motherhood meant. The first to leave was Marcus. He would attend doctor. Summer's school on a trial basis, living in a small apartment Jessica had rented nearby where she could monitor him. The morning of his departure was etched into all their memories. The bear mother walked him to the cave entrance, her massive form trembling slightly. Marcus threw his arms around her neck, burying his face in her fur, and for a long moment they stayed like that. Then she made a sound, a complex vocalization that the other children later translated as, "You carry my heart with you." Marcus nodded, unable to speak, and walked away with Ethan without looking back. If he had looked back, Ethan thought, he might not have been able to leave. The transition was harder than any of them had anticipated. Marcus, despite his intelligence and preparation, struggled with things the other children at school took for granted. The constant noise overwhelmed his sensitive hearing. The artificial lights gave him headaches. The processed food made him sick. The casual cruelty children showed each other horrified him. He lasted 2 weeks before Jessica found him one night in the apartment, curled in a corner, making the same sounds the bear mother made when she was comforting the babies. He wanted to go home, not to visit, but to go home. But something unexpected happened when Marcus returned to the cave. He didn't come back defeated or broken. He came back with knowledge, with understanding, with a clearer vision of what he wanted to create. He told the others about the human world honestly, its wonders and its terrors, its possibilities and its limitations. He said he would try again, but differently. Not to become part of that world, but to build a bridge between worlds. He envisioned a place where children like them could exist without hiding, where their gifts would be celebrated rather than feared. It was an impossible dream, but then their entire existence was impossible. Luna decided to try next, but her approach was different. She didn't want to attend school. She wanted to work with animals, to use her gifts to help. Jessica arranged for her to volunteer at a wildlife rehabilitation center run by a friend who asked few questions. Luna thrived there, healing animals that others had given up on, calming the most traumatized creatures with her presence alone. The staff thought she was simply gifted with animals, not knowing that she could literally understand their pain and communicate comfort in their own languages. She came home to the cave each night, sharing stories of the animals she'd helped. inspiring the younger children with possibilities they hadn't imagined. As the seasons changed, a pattern emerged. Some children ventured out into the human world for specific purposes: education, experiences, contributions they wanted to make. But they always returned to the cave, to their true family, to the bear mother who loved them unconditionally. They were creating something unprecedented, a community that existed between worlds, neither fully wild nor fully civilized, but something entirely new. Government records showed no trace of them. They existed in the margins, in the spaces between what society tracked and monitored. Avery, the girl who had arrived already knowing both worlds, became their bridge. She was old enough to get a part-time job in town, using documents Jessica had carefully crafted. She rented a post office box where packages could be received, opened a bank account where funds could be deposited. She became their connection to the necessities of the modern world while maintaining the secrecy of their true nature. She also started documenting their story, not for publication but for posterity. Someday, she believed, the world would be ready to know about them. But not yet. The younger children watched all of this with varying degrees of interest and concern. Some, like Lily with her green eyes, seemed content to stay in the cave forever, to live wild and free without the complications of the human world. Others showed increasing curiosity about the lives their older siblings were describing. The bear mother treated each child's choice with equal respect, never pushing them one way or another, always supporting whatever decision they made. Her love remained constant whether they stayed or ventured out, whether they succeeded in the human world or retreated from it. Jessica's research during this period was revolutionary, though she could never publish it. The children's development challenged every assumption about human potential. Their enhanced senses, their intuitive understanding of natural systems, their ability to communicate with other species, all of it suggested that humans had lost more than they'd gained in their separation from nature. But more than their abilities, it was their emotional development that astounded her. Raised with unconditional love and acceptance, without the competitive pressures and arbitrary rules of civilization, they'd developed an empathy and wisdom that seemed to belong to a different species entirely. One evening, as spring arrived with its promise of renewal, Jessica sat with the bear mother while the children played in the cave's main chamber. Through Lily, who had become their most skilled translator, the bear mother told Jessica more of her story. She had been a researcher herself once, studying indigenous practices and their connection to consciousness. She'd lost her daughter, her only child, to a disease that modern medicine couldn't cure. In her grief, she'd sought out the last practitioners of the old ways, begging them for any escape from her pain. They'd offered her transformation, warning her that she would forget her human life gradually, that she would become fully bear except for one thing. She would always remember how to love as a mother loves. But something had gone differently than expected. Instead of forgetting her humanity, she'd retained it, trapped in a form that couldn't express it fully. The first years had been agony, aware but unable to communicate, powerful but unable to return to her human life. Then she'd found the first child, abandoned in a dumpster during a harsh winter. Saving that baby had given her purpose, had made the transformation bearable. Each child she saved added to her humanity rather than diminishing it. She hadn't become less human by becoming a bear. She'd become more than either. The story explained so much. The cave paintings that had been there when Ethan first arrived, the sophisticated understanding of human needs, the deliberate preparation for the children's eventual choices. Sarah, the woman who had become the bear mother, had been preparing for this from the beginning. She'd known that someday the children would grow up, would need to choose their paths. Every lesson, Every moment of love, every careful preparation had been leading to this. She wasn't just saving them from immediate death. She was preparing them to save others, to bridge worlds, to heal the wounded relationship between humanity and nature. As Jessica processed this revelation, Marcus returned from his second attempt at school integration, this time more successful. He'd lasted a month, made a friend who didn't ask too many questions about his unusual background, even joined the school's environmental club where his knowledge impressed everyone. But he still came home to the cave each weekend, still needed the peace and acceptance he found there. He was learning to exist in both worlds, not fully belonging to either, but finding his own unique space between them. The pattern continued through the summer and into fall. More children tried ventures into the human world with varying degrees of success. Some, like Luna, found specific niches where their gifts were assets rather than oddities. Others discovered that the human world held nothing they wanted and chose to remain wild. The cave evolved into a base of operations rather than a prison, a home that the children could leave and return to as they needed. The bear mother presided over it all with patient love, celebrating their successes, comforting their failures, always reminding them that they were perfect exactly as they were. It was during this time that they faced their first real crisis. A group of hikers, ignoring the posted warnings about geological instability, had gotten lost and stumbled near the cave system. One of them, a young man named David, had fallen and broken his leg badly. His cries of pain reached the cave, and before anyone could stop her, Lily had run out to help. She'd found David and his panicked friends, and without thinking, had used her abilities to calm them, to splint David's leg with an expertise no 7-year-old should possess. The hikers were too grateful and amazed to ask many questions at the time, but later, in the hospital, David couldn't stop talking about the mysterious child who had appeared from nowhere and saved him. The story made local news. A young girl living wild in the mountains, with unusual knowledge and abilities. Search parties were organized to find her, to rescue her from whatever situation had her living in the wilderness. Ethan used his position to misdirect the searches, but it was clear their secret was in danger. They held a family meeting in the cave. Everyone from the bear mother to the youngest toddler participating in their own way. The consensus was clear. They would not abandon their home, but they needed better protection, better ways to deflect attention. It was Avery who suggested the solution. They would create a cover story, a legitimate reason for children to be in the area. Using Jessica's connections and some creative paperwork, they established the Wilderness Learning Collective, an experimental education program for gifted children who thrived in natural settings. Jessica would be the director, Ethan the wilderness guide. The older children who could pass for students in such a program would be officially enrolled. The younger ones would be explained as siblings visiting during school breaks. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them a layer of legitimacy that might deflect casual investigation. The bear mother couldn't be part of this official story, of course. She became their hidden heart, the secret that bound them all together. The children who ventured into the human world wore her love like invisible armor, carrying her strength with them into challenging situations. Those who stayed wild became her assistants, helping her care for new arrivals, because children were still being found, still being saved, still being brought to the cave by forces that seemed to transcend ordinary understanding. One of these new arrivals was particularly significant. A baby, no more than a few months old, found not abandoned but orphaned when his parents died in a car accident with no other family to claim him. How the bear mother knew about him, how she managed to retrieve him from the hospital itself, remained a mystery that even Jessica couldn't explain. But there he was one morning, nestled against the bear mother's warm body, contentedly nursing from a bottle she held with impossible gentleness. The older children named him Hope, and he became a symbol of their continued purpose, their ongoing mission to save those who needed saving. As winter approached again, marking nearly 6 years since Ethan's first discovery, their community had evolved into something unprecedented. They were not quite a family in the traditional sense, not quite a school, not quite a tribe, but elements of all three. They had created their own culture, their own way of existing that drew from both human and wild wisdom. The children spoke multiple languages: English, the gesture-sound communication of their early years, and what they called the deep language that connected all living things. They celebrated birthdays and seasonal changes with equal enthusiasm. They learned mathematics and tracking, literature and survival skills, art history and how to read the subtle signs of approaching weather in the behavior of insects. Jessica had begun compiling everything into a comprehensive document she called the Bridge Generation. It wasn't for publication, not yet, but someday the world would need to know about these children and what they represented. They were proof that humanity's future didn't have to be separate from nature, that the path forward might actually be a path back to something essential that had been lost. Every day with them reinforced her belief that they were not anomalies but pioneers, showing what human children could become when raised with different values, different connections, different possibilities. The bear mother, Sarah, had begun showing signs of age. Her muzzle was graying, her movements slightly slower, though she was still formidable and fully capable of protecting her charges. Through the children, she communicated that she felt her purpose was nearly complete. Not that she was dying, but that she had accomplished what she'd transformed to do. She had created something that would outlast her, a new way of being human that could heal the wounded world. The children were no longer just survivors she'd rescued. They were teachers, bridges, healers in their own right. Marcus had started writing too, his perspective different from Avery's documentation or Jessica's scientific observations. He wrote about what it felt like to be between worlds, to understand both the language of civilization and the language of the wild. He wrote about the bear mother's lessons, not just the practical ones, but the deeper teachings about love and sacrifice and the courage to be different. His writing was beautiful and painful, full of a wisdom that no teenager should possess, but that their unusual upbringing had gifted him. Jessica believed that his words, when the world was ready for them, would be the key to helping others understand what had happened in that cave. Luna's work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had attracted attention from veterinary schools. They wanted to know how a girl with no formal training could diagnose and treat animals with such unprecedented success. She deflected their questions with Jessica's help, claiming to be self-taught from books and observation. But the pressure was building for her to either reveal her gifts fully or retreat from the human world entirely. She chose a third option, deciding to actually pursue formal veterinary training, to add human knowledge to her innate abilities. It would mean leaving the cave for extended periods, but she was ready. The bear mother gave her blessing with a ceremony that involved all the children, a passing of knowledge and love that would sustain Luna through the challenges ahead. The younger children were growing too, each developing their own unique blend of wild wisdom and human learning. Lily had become fascinated with botany, able to identify and understand plants in ways that went beyond scientific classification. She knew which plants sang to each other underground through fungal networks, which ones warned of danger, which ones could heal ailments that modern medicine struggled with. Connor, now 8, showed an affinity for weather patterns, able to predict changes days in advance by reading signs invisible to others. Haley, 6, had begun composing music that seemed to capture the essence of the forest itself, using instruments she crafted from natural materials. Each child was becoming a bridge in their own way, carrying gifts that could help humanity reconnect with the natural world. But they were also simply children, playing and laughing and squabbling occasionally like any siblings. They had inside jokes about Ethan's terrible campfire cooking and Jessica's tendency to lecture when excited about a discovery. They teased each other gently and protected each other fiercely. They were, in every way that mattered, a family. As the first snows of winter began to fall, they received unexpected news. Dr. Summers from the boarding school had figured out more than they'd told her. She arrived one day with Jessica, her face calm but her eyes showing she knew she was about to learn something extraordinary. The bear mother made the decision to reveal herself, walking into the main chamber where Dr. Summers waited. The woman's reaction was not fear or disbelief, but a deep, profound recognition. "My grandmother told me stories," she said quietly, "about the old ways, about those who walked between worlds. I thought they were just stories." Dr. Summers became their newest ally, bringing resources and connections they desperately needed. She helped establish scholarship programs for the children who wanted formal education. She created research partnerships that allowed Jessica to study the children's abilities without revealing their true origin. Most importantly, she brought a perspective from indigenous traditions that helped them understand what Sarah's transformation really meant. It wasn't just a personal choice, but part of an ancient practice of creating guardians, beings who could protect the sacred balance between human and natural worlds. With Dr. Summers' help, they learned that Sarah wasn't the only one. Throughout history, in times of great imbalance, individuals had made similar sacrifices, taking on animal form to fulfill specific purposes. Most were never discovered, living their transformed lives in secret, doing their work without recognition. But Sarah was different because she had retained so much of her human consciousness, because she had created not just a rescue, but a revolution. The children she'd raised were something new, a generation that could truly bridge worlds because they belonged fully to both and neither. The revelation changed how they understood their purpose. They weren't just an anomaly to be hidden, but part of something larger, an ancient response to modern crisis. The world was facing environmental collapse, a complete disconnection from the natural systems that sustained life. These children, raised between worlds, might hold keys to healing that rift, not through dramatic gestures but through their very existence, proof that humans could be different, could remember their place in the larger web of life. As they prepared for the challenges of another year, everyone in the cave felt the weight and wonder of their purpose. Some of the older children were ready to take their gifts into the world more fully. Marcus was planning to start a blog, anonymous for now, sharing wisdom about connecting with nature. Luna was beginning her veterinary studies with a full scholarship from Dr. Summers' connections. Avery was investigating journalism programs, wanting to learn how to tell stories that could change hearts and minds. They were moving into the world not as hidden anomalies, but as quiet revolutionaries. But they always came home to the cave, to the bear mother's embrace, to the younger children who needed their guidance. The cave had become a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where the impossible was normal, where love transcended every boundary, where children could grow into their fullest potential without the limitations of conventional thinking. It was a place where a bear could be a better mother than most humans, where orphans could become teachers, where the abandoned could become the healers of a broken world. One night, as the full moon illuminated the snow-covered mountains, they all gathered in the main chamber for their monthly celebration. It was a tradition the bear mother had started, a time when everyone shared their experiences, their challenges, their victories. Marcus spoke about making his first real friend at school, someone who accepted his strangeness without question. Luna described saving a hawk that veterinarians had declared beyond help. Lily shared a discovery about mushroom communication that had Jessica frantically taking notes. Each child, from the oldest to the youngest, contributed something to the circle. When it came to the bear mother's turn, she did something unprecedented. With great effort, she stood on her hind legs and made sounds none of them had heard before. It took the children several minutes to translate, working together to understand the complexity of what she was expressing. She was telling them about the future, about a time when their secret would be revealed, when the world would know about them. But it wouldn't be a disaster. It would be a doorway. Their story would inspire others to remember what had been forgotten, to seek connection instead of separation, to choose love over fear. She showed them, through gestures and sounds the children translated, a vision of gardens where humans and animals worked together, of cities that breathed with living systems instead of choking on dead concrete, of children everywhere learning the languages of other species. It wasn't a utopia, but a possibility, a path that their existence had opened. They were the proof that humans could evolve not through technology, but through remembering their place in the family of all life. Their strange, impossible family was a seed that would grow into a forest of change. The vision filled them all with a mixture of hope and responsibility. They were not just survivors or oddities. They were pioneers of a new way of being human. The bear mother, Sarah, who had chosen to become something more than human to save human children, had created more than a rescue operation. She had created a revolution of love, a quiet transformation that started with abandoned infants and could end with humanity finding its way home to its place in the natural world. As the celebration continued into the night, with songs that blended human and animal voices, with stories that bridged worlds, with laughter that echoed through the cave like a promise of better times, Ethan and Jessica sat together watching it all. They had become witnesses to something that shouldn't exist, but did, guardians of a secret that was really a gift to the world. They knew challenges lay ahead. Discovery was inevitable eventually. The children would face prejudice and misunderstanding. The bear mother wouldn't live forever, though her legacy would. But tonight, in this moment, they were perfect. A family forged not from blood, but from choice, not from convention, but from love that transcended every boundary humans had created. The bear mother gathered the youngest children against her warm body for sleep while the older ones continued, talking quietly, planning their futures, dreaming their impossible dreams that their unusual upbringing had taught them could become real. The cave, lit by the soft glow of solar-powered lights Jessica had installed, felt like the safest place in the world, a womb of transformation where humans were being reborn as something both ancient and new. 20 years had passed since that first snowy day when Ethan had followed strange tracks to an impossible discovery. 20 years of secrets and revelations, of children growing and choosing, of love proving stronger than logic. The original infants were now adults, some fully integrated into human society while maintaining their wild wisdom, others choosing to remain guardians of the sanctuary. They had children of their own now, a third generation raised with the knowledge that the boundaries between human and nature were illusions, that consciousness was far more fluid and connected than science had yet discovered. The bear mother was ancient now by bear standards, her once dark fur completely silver, her movements slow but still purposeful. She spent most of her time in the warmest part of the cave, surrounded by children and grandchildren who saw her not as an animal, but as the matriarch of their impossible clan. The cave had expanded into a complex of connected chambers, some natural, some carefully excavated, creating space for the growing community. It was part home, part school, part sanctuary, and entirely unique in the world. Marcus had become a renowned environmental writer, though no one knew the source of his profound insights into animal consciousness. His books were changing how people thought about their relationship with nature, though he never revealed the full truth of his upbringing. Luna had become a veterinarian, whose success rate with hopeless cases had made her legendary. She ran a clinic at the edge of the wilderness where she could slip away to visit the cave regularly. Avery had become a documentary filmmaker, creating works that danced around the edges of their truth, preparing the world for eventual revelation. The younger children had grown into their own purposes. Lily had discovered several new species of fungi and pioneered understanding of forest communication networks, though she couldn't explain how she knew where to look or what to observe. Connor worked with meteorological services, his weather predictions uncannily accurate, though his methods remained mysterious. Haley's compositions were performed by orchestras worldwide, music that seemed to capture something essential about the natural world that touched listeners deeply. But it was the newest generation that truly showed what Sarah's sacrifice had achieved. These children, born to those raised in the cave, were something unprecedented. They possessed the abilities of their parents, but refined, integrated, natural. They could shift between human and wild consciousness as easily as breathing. They spoke to animals not as a special gift, but as naturally as they spoke to each other. They understood ecosystems intuitively, could feel the health or illness of environments in their bones. They were what humanity could become if it remembered its place in the web of life. It was one of these children, a 5-year-old girl named Sarah after the bear mother, who precipitated the revelation that would change everything. Young Sarah had wandered further from the cave than allowed. Following an injured fox, she wanted to help. A nature photographer captured her on film, this small child leading a fox with obvious trust between them, communicating in sounds no human should be able to make. The photograph went viral before anyone could suppress it. The world wanted to know who this child was, where she came from, how she could do what the photograph clearly showed her doing. The family gathered for an emergency council. The bear mother, despite her age and frailty, participated fully, her intelligence still sharp. Through the children's translation, she gave her verdict. It was time. The world was ready, or as ready as it would ever be. Their secret had given them time to grow strong, to establish themselves, to create a foundation that couldn't be destroyed by revelation. Now, their truth could become a gift to a world desperately needing new ways forward. The decision was unanimous. They would reveal themselves, but on their own terms. Jessica and Ethan worked with Avery to create a documentary that told their story from the beginning. Marcus wrote articles that provided context, explaining the science and philosophy behind what had happened. Luna prepared medical documentation showing that the children were healthy, thriving, exceptional, but not exploited. Dr. Summers mobilized her network of progressive educators and indigenous knowledge keepers to provide support and credibility. They would control the narrative, present their truth in a way that emphasized love and possibility rather than sensation and fear. The night before the documentary's release, they held one last celebration in the cave as a secret family. The bear mother, Sarah, was dying. They all knew it, had known it for weeks. She had held on for this moment, to see her children ready to face the world as themselves. She lay in the center of the main chamber, surrounded by all of them, from the adults she'd rescued as infants to the newest babies born into their impossible family. Each person, from oldest to youngest, came to her, placed their hands on her ancient body, and thanked her in their own way. Marcus spoke for all of them when he knelt beside her massive head, now resting heavily on the cave floor. "You saved us all," he said, his voice thick with tears, "not just from death, but from never knowing what we could be. You showed us that love is stronger than form, that family is about choice, that humans can be more than what we've become. We promise to carry your gift forward, to save others as you saved us, to bridge the worlds you taught us to walk between. The bear mother made one last sound, a deep rumble that needed no translation. It was love, pure and simple, the love that had transformed her and them and would transform the world. She died as the sun rose, peaceful and surrounded by the family she'd created. They buried her in the forest she'd loved, in a place where wildflowers grew in impossible abundance. The grave was unmarked except by the children who would always know where to find it, who would bring their own children and grandchildren to tell the story of the bear, who had been a woman who had chosen to become love itself. The documentary was released that evening, and the world would never be the same. The response was everything they'd feared and hoped. Scientists demanded to study them. Religious groups called them either miracles or abominations. Governments wanted to regulate them. Media wanted to exploit them. But there were also millions who understood immediately what they represented. Hope for a different way forward. Proof that the separation between human and nature was a wound that could be healed. Support came from unexpected places. Indigenous communities recognized them as the return of something ancient and necessary. Environmental movements saw them as living proof of their philosophies. Parents of neurodivergent children saw them as validation that different wasn't less than just different. They handled the attention with the wisdom their unusual upbringing had given them. They didn't hide, but didn't perform either. They lived their lives openly now, showing by example what humans could be when raised with different values. Some of the children became teachers, creating schools that blended wild wisdom with human knowledge. Others became researchers, using their unique abilities to make discoveries that conventional science had missed. Some became artists, creating works that helped others feel the connection to nature they embodied. Each found their own way to bridge worlds, to fulfill the promise of their impossible beginning. The cave remained their sanctuary, though it was no longer secret. It became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though they strictly limited access. People came not to gawk but to learn, to understand, to be changed by proximity to a different way of being. The younger children still grew up there, still learned from the forest first and books second, still developed abilities that science couldn't fully explain. But now they did so knowing they weren't freaks or mistakes, but pioneers of human potential, showing what was possible when love transcended every boundary. The impact rippled outward in ways large and small. Other children raised in extreme circumstances came forward, showing similar abilities. Research into human-animal communication advanced rapidly. Conservation efforts gained new urgency as people began to understand that saving nature meant saving ourselves. The rigid boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness began to soften. It wasn't a revolution in the traditional sense, but an evolution, a remembering of what humanity had forgotten in its rush toward separation from the natural world. Years passed, and the children of the cave became leaders in various fields, always marked by their unique perspective, their ability to see connections others missed. They married, had children, created communities that embodied the values Sarah had taught them. The cave children, as history would remember them, became proof that humanity's future didn't have to be a continuation of its past. They showed that evolution wasn't just biological, but conscious, chosen, directed by love rather than survival alone. Some of the original children wrote memoirs that became foundational texts for new philosophies of human nature integration. Marcus's book, Between Worlds, Growing Up Wild and Human, became required reading in schools that were transforming their approach to education. Luna's research on interspecies communication opened entire new fields of study. Avery's films inspired a generation to seek connection with nature rather than dominion over it. Each of them, in their own way, fulfilled the promise of their impossible childhood. But perhaps the most important impact was on the ordinary people who heard their story and realized that they too could choose differently. Parents began taking their children into nature regularly, teaching them to observe and listen rather than just look. Schools created programs that emphasized connection and empathy over competition. Cities began designing with nature integrated rather than excluded. The change was slow, sometimes barely perceptible, but it was real. The seed Sarah had planted when she chose to transform was growing into a forest. The children who had known Sarah personally became the keepers of her story, making sure it was told correctly. She hadn't been a saint or a magical being, but a heartbroken woman who had chosen love over despair, service over surrender. Her transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but necessary for her soul, and, as it turned out, for the world. She had saved 43 children directly, but through them, she had saved countless others who learned that they too could choose love over fear, connection over separation, possibility over limitation. As the original cave children aged, they made sure the sanctuary continued. New children were still brought there, not abandoned infants now, but children whose gifts made them misfits in conventional society. They learned the old ways and the new, the wild wisdom and the human knowledge, preparing to be bridges in their own time. The cave had become a school unlike any other, where the curriculum included tracking and calculus, plant communication and literature, animal behavior and human history, all taught as interconnected subjects rather than separate disciplines. Dr. Summers, before she died, established a foundation to protect and support the cave sanctuary and others like it that were beginning to emerge around the world. These places weren't trying to return to some imagined primitive past, but to create a future where human intelligence and natural wisdom could merge into something greater than either alone. They were proving that civilization didn't have to mean separation from nature, that progress could mean growing closer to rather than further from the living systems that sustained all life. The legacy of Sarah's transformation spread in ways she never could have imagined. Scientists studying the cave children's abilities discovered dormant capacities in human DNA that suggested these gifts weren't mutations but rememberings, abilities all humans potentially possessed but had forgotten how to access. Musicians inspired by Haley's compositions created new forms that seemed to resonate with natural frequencies, creating healing and connection. Architects inspired by the cave's organic organization designed buildings that breathed and lived rather than stood static and dead. But the most profound change was in how people understood family and love. Sarah had shown that motherhood transcended species, that love could reshape reality itself. Families began defining themselves by choice and commitment rather than just blood. Communities formed around shared values rather than just proximity. The rigid categories that had defined human society for so long began to soften, allowing for new forms of connection and belonging. The cave children had shown that different wasn't dangerous, but necessary for evolution. As the story spread and evolved, becoming myth as much as history, certain truths remained constant. Love was stronger than form. Family was about choice. Humans were not separate from nature but part of it. These simple truths, embodied by children raised by a bear who had been a woman, began to heal wounds humanity hadn't even known it carried. The separation anxiety of a species that had forgotten its place in the family of life began to ease. The possibility of coming home, not to a place but to a way of being, became real. The cave still exists, though its location is protected, and its visitors carefully chosen. Children still grow up there, learning to walk between worlds with grace and purpose. The bear mother's grave has become a garden where impossible flowers bloom, where species that shouldn't coexist thrive together, where the boundary between wild and cultivated disappears. People come there to remember what Sarah discovered through her transformation, that love can make anything possible, even the impossible. The final truth of the cave children's story wasn't about the extraordinary abilities they developed or the scientific discoveries they enabled. It was about proof that humans could choose to be different, could evolve through love rather than competition, could remember their place in the web of life before it was too late. Sarah, the woman who became a bear to save children no one else would save, had given humanity a gift beyond measure. She had shown that transformation was possible, that the boundaries we believed were fixed were actually fluid, that love could literally change what we were capable of becoming.